Hello everybody. I'm sorry that we're starting 5 minutes late, but I hope you understand we had a lot to get through in the meeting, and so we started tea slightly late. So I hope this is not the way things are going to proceed going forwards. But we're delighted to welcome our speaker today, Katharine Harrison from York, who has a long association with the association. She was one of our Ox scholars. This presentation comes out of her PhD, which is now being turned into a publication or publications with support from the Paul Mellon Foundation. So we're really delighted to get an advanced preview, and you can see it's going to be a real visual feast. So thank you very much, Katharine.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you for inviting me to speak here today. It's an honour to be here. My paper today is drawn from my doctoral research on the 15th century St Cuthbert window at York Minster. And I thought this was an appropriate choice because, as Alex has just said, the BAA generously awarded me an Ox scholarship, which enabled me to complete the writing up of my thesis in 2019. So thank you. I'm incredibly grateful, and it's a real pleasure to be able to share my research with you. In my talk today, I'm going to focus upon the window's narrative, exploring how the story of St Cuthbert was crafted. Made in around 1440, the window is a rare example of a monumental narrative that survives in situ. And even more unusually, a known pictorial source for the window also survives. This makes the window a valuable source for understanding contemporary devotion to St Cuthbert, as well as medieval narrative design. Analysis of the narrative also suggests that the creators of the window were consciously responding to the architectural setting, its audience, and the interests of the patron, Thomas Langley. I'm going to argue today that the window's narrative and wider design were intended to create a specific vision of St Cuthbert as a model bishop, appropriate not only for the patron, but for an elite ecclesiastical audience. So I'm aware that most of you will probably have heard of St Cuthbert, and I know that someone has a dog called Cuthbert. But for those who are less familiar with him, I'm just going to give a very brief potted history to introduce him. So St Cuthbert was an Anglo-Saxon noble who lived from around 634 to 687 CE. He became a monk and later a bishop, following some years spent as a hermit on the island of Farne, where he ultimately returned to die. After being entombed on Lindisfarne, and then following the opening of his tomb 11 years later, when his body was found intact, he was reburied and began to be venerated by the monks of Lindisfarne. Over the following decades, his popularity grew, establishing him as Northern England's most important saint. When the monks fled Lindisfarne following Viking attacks in the late 9th century, they exhumed Cuthbert and added the head of St Oswald to his coffin. And this is why he's often shown holding the head of St Oswald, as you can see just here. The community and their descendants carried Cuthbert's coffin with them as they travelled around the north of England, eventually settling in Durham at the end of the 10th century. In around 1080, the community of Cuthbert, who were the descendants of these monks, from Lindisfarne, were ousted by the Benedictines, who took control of the cult at Durham and began rebuilding the cathedral. In 1104, the Benedictine monks translated St Cuthbert's relics into a new shrine and began recording new miracles. Cuthbert continued to be an extremely popular saint throughout the medieval period, and his shrine at Durham remained a major pilgrimage destination until the Reformation. The St Cuthbert window at York Minster is one of only a handful of surviving artworks depicting scenes from Cuthbert's life. The window is located in the southeastern transept in the choir of York Minster. You can see circled here in yellow. And as I've said, it dates to around 1440. It's about 20 meters tall, and it contains 154 stained glass panels. Don't worry, we're not going to talk about every single one individually. Beneath the tracery, horizontal transoms, which are, you can just see in this image here, this stonework, divide the window into 4 sections, and each of these contains 30 panels. The upper 3 sections are now filled with 75 scenes from the life of St. Cuthbert, while the lowest section is divided into 2 tiers of kneeling figures, arranged around a large standing figure of Cuthbert. In my talk today, I'm going to be discussing the window as it appeared in the 15th century. So I want to just draw your attention to the fact that the window, as it appears today, differs significantly from this original arrangement. The tracery is now filled with 19th century glass depicting saints, and the 19th century panels in the window are highlighted in this diagram in pale blue. Of the 75 panels showing scenes from Cuthbert's life, 64 are original, 10 date to the 1880s, and 1 is a composite made in the 20th century. The current arrangement of the narrative panels, which are intended to be read from left to right, from the bottom to the top, reverses the original reading order. During the course of my doctoral research, I was able to map the historic disarrangement of the window, which you can hopefully get a sense of from the diagram on the screen. So on the left, we have the window circa 1440, and then so the next one's 1690, 1877, and 2021, when it was removed for conservation. And I've highlighted the first 2 panels from the narrative sequence, 7A and 9C, but labelled here as 1 and 2, to show how they've moved through the window over time. So every time the window's been repaired, panels have shifted around, and by 1877, the window is in complete disarrangement. Despite this, I was able to reconstruct the original narrative sequence of the window, drawing upon the physical evidence of the glass, but also other visual cycles, documentary sources, and antiquarian records, most notably James Torr's description from the late 17th century, which you can see a picture of on the right. I'm not really going to talk about the evidence and the process of reconstructing the narrative today, because I want to focus on the narrative itself, but I'm happy to discuss it at the end if anyone has questions. As I reconstructed the original appearance of the window, the sophistication of its imagery and narrative design became apparent. It depicts a unique version of Cuthbert's life, which appears to have been designed in response to a range of factors, including the window's architectural and devotional setting, audience, and contemporary concerns. By analysing the narrative in relation to the overall design of the window and its wider setting, I hope to shed light on the window's intended significance and the complexity of 15th century approaches to narrative design. So we'll start by looking at the overall structure of the window as it would have appeared in 1440. And I'm going to skim over the tracery today, largely because there's very little evidence for its original appearance. We know that there were figures of saints, but other than St. Katharine, who was identified by Torr because she had her wheel with her, we don't know who the other saints were. Beneath the tracery, as I've said, there were originally, sorry, I feel like I've jumped myself around. Okay. Beneath the tracery, 70 panels showing the life of St. Cuthbert filled the uppermost 3 sections of the window, and the story began with Cuthbert's birth, just here on the top left, and read from left to right, progressing the whole way down the window to end with a depiction of his shrine just down here. Row 13, which is not visible from the ground, was filled with plain glazing, which is shown in this diagram in grey. I'm going to return to the design of the narrative in a moment, but first I want to introduce the window's donor, Thomas Langley, and the striking commemorative display in the lowest section of the window. In the central light, we have a large standing figure of St. Cuthbert, just here, and he's surrounded by 2 tiers of kneeling figures. Langley is down in the lower right, just here, and he kneels looking towards St. Cuthbert with his hands raised in prayer. Beneath him is an inscription in Latin which identifies him as the window's donor and requests prayers for his soul. Langley was Dean of York from 1401 to 1406. and then he became Bishop of Durham in 1406, a post that he held until his death in 1437. So we can see that he was well connected to both York and Cuthbert. Langley's illustrious career as a royal councillor and diplomat began in the service of John of Gaunt, who was Duke of Lancaster, and he spent his life supporting Gaunt's descendants, the Lancastrian kings Henry IV, V, and VI. The display in the lowest section of the window commemorates Langley's royal, political, and ecclesiastical connections. In the upper tier, Gaunt and the Lancastrian kings are depicted flanking St. Cuthbert. So we have John of Gaunt just here, Henry IV on the far right, and then Henry V and VI on the left. In the lower row, to the left of Langley, are four more figures with whom Langley had worked alongside in the Lancastrian government. Two of these figures are Archbishops of York, so we have Henry Boet on the left, and then John Kemp next to Langley. And then we have two other members of the Lancastrian dynasty, Henry Beaufort and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. Although the window was ultimately installed after Langley's death in 1437, so as I said, around 1440, the specific selection of these individuals helps to confirm his involvement in its design. In the past, this monumental Lancastrian display has been interpreted as an attempt at propaganda due to the political events of the early 15th century, most notably the 1405 uprising against Henry IV, which led to the execution for treason of Richard Scrope, Archbishop of York. However, it's worth noting that this interpretation doesn't really align with the political situation at the time that the window was made 3 decades later. Henry Boet, who ultimately succeeded Scrope as Archbishop of York, had long served as a councillor for Henry IV and appears to have smoothed relations with members of the York community, including canons pardoned for their involvement in the 1405 revolt. At the time that the window was made, Boet's successor, John Kemp, was also a long-standing councillor in the Lancastrian government. And that's not to say that the commemorative display cannot be read as an expression of legitimacy in the Lancastrian dynasty. The careful arrangement of figures presents an idealized vision of Christian hierarchy, with nobles and elite churchmen supporting divinely appointed kings. St. Cuthbert stands in the middle of the group, emphasizing his role as intercessor between earthly and heavenly realms. The prominence of Oswald's crowned head in Cuthbert's left hand creates a visual parallel with the crowned Lancastrians. This, combined with Cuthbert's gesture of blessing, can be seen to articulate the legitimacy of the dynasty. However, while the display clearly promotes the Lancastrians, it's unlikely that the community in York would have seen this as an act of overt or unusual propaganda. It was not uncommon for donors of windows to depict or commemorate contemporary rulers, especially those whom they had personally served. And in fact, the connections between Langley and the individuals depicted make this section of the window as much a personal commemoration as it is a symbolic display. The choice of St. Cuthbert, the patron saint of Langley's episcopal seat at Durham, can be linked to both Langley and the elite clerical audience at York. As a bishop saint, the depiction of Cuthbert naturally enables visual parallels between the saint and Langley, who, as Bishop of Durham, could claim Cuthbert as his predecessor and role model. Langley's death before the completion of the window brings into question the exact extent of his involvement in its design. But he can be linked to several now lost artworks depicting the life of St. Cuthbert, including 2 other monumental cycles at Durham, both of which were made during his lifetime. And the specific combination of figures in the commemorative section suggests that he was involved in at least this element of the design. However, the depiction of St. Cuthbert, a model of episcopal behaviour, and his status as the premier saint of the Northern Province would have been equally relevant to the elite clerical audience at York, and this is something that I want to keep in mind as we turn to consider the narrative sequence. I want to demonstrate how the narrative of St. Cuthbert was used to craft a vision of Cuthbert's life that responds to its patron, setting, and audience, while also following hagiographic and visual conventions. And I'm going to try and draw out how the makers of the window were responding creatively to various visual and textual sources alongside these hagiographic and visual conventions, and presumably any instructions that they were given by the commissioners or commissioners of the window. And as a side note here, I'm being deliberately vague in my use of words like creator and commissioner because it is difficult to pin down precisely who was involved in the design. And I want to stay focused on what the narrative is telling us about that. So let's start with a broad view of the narrative. By the 15th century, numerous texts had been compiled which described the life of St. Cuthbert and the subsequent events and miracles associated with his cult. Several pictorial cycles had also been created. From studying the window alongside these other Cuthbertine narratives, it appears that the scenes can be linked to two textual traditions. The earlier of these two, Bede's prose life, was written around 720 CE and was considered to be the most authentic of Cuthbert's lives throughout the medieval period. The other is a slightly lesser known source, the Irish life of St. Cuthbert, a collection that was compiled around 1190 CE, and which provides details of St. Cuthbert's alleged origins in Ireland and his childhood. This collection only survives in a handful of manuscripts, where it most often features before Bede's prose life, an arrangement that is echoed in the St. Cuthbert window, and probably also in the two lost cycles at Durham. As you can see in this diagram, the upper two rows, so just here within the green box, contain 10 scenes derived from the Irish life. The remaining 60 panels of the narrative showed events described in Bede's prose life. The window as a whole provides a comprehensive representation of Cuthbert's life, depicting scenes from his childhood at the top of the window and progressing down, showing his years as a monk, hermit, and bishop, culminating in his death and establishment as a saint. And really that's not surprising because Cuthbert's life, like all saints' lives, was intended to authenticate his sanctity and therefore his ability to act as an intercessor between ordinary people and God. And to achieve this, it was necessary to follow hagiographic conventions by including events, key events within his life, such as preaching and healing, that demonstrated how his exemplary life was modelled on Christ's. What's most evident is that the focus is upon events from Cuthbert's lifetime, as despite the numerous posthumous miracles that have been recorded, the only posthumous scenes depicted in the window are those that are used to establish his status as a saint, and I'll come on to this a bit later. But in fact, of Bede's 7 chapters dealing with posthumous events, 4 were deliberately omitted from the window. And to give you a sense of how drastic a cut that is, in contrast, only 3 of the 39 chapters dealing with events from Cuthbert's lifetime are not depicted. The augmentation of the narrative through the addition and omission of different episodes is also not really surprising. It was very common for saints' lives to be adapted and developed over time to suit the contemporary interests and needs of the communities who controlled these narratives, and that's especially true of visual cycles. In recent decades, researchers increasingly demonstrated that visual versions of saints' lives were often unique and quite often tailored to suit their setting. So, for example, Chloe Morgan has shown that the 13th century St. Katharine window in York Minster's chapter house employs a unique narrative construction which emphasises the debates between Katharine and the philosophers by dedicating a substantial proportion of panels to these scenes. She argues convincingly that by representing a, quote, idealised version of debate, the window served not just as an example to the canons, but articulated the intended function of the chapter, whose meetings were conducted below the window. In the St. Cuthbert window, we can see a similar technique at work, whereby the distribution of episodes across panels varies. And basically, within this diagram, different groups of panels are color-coded, and the color alternates. So there's 3 colors, and it's just so that you can tell where one group starts and the next one ends. This is a strategy that is employed by visual cycles in many media, and it's fairly common in stained glass, particularly in the 15th century, when narrative windows were characterized by the use of stonework to create large, regularized frameworks, which were used to structure the narrative. The windows creators would have had to work within the constraints of the regularized structure, but it also enabled them to create emphases by establishing patterns of reading and then breaking them. And we can see this in the St. Cuthbert window, where most panels show a single self-contained episode, but there are 16 instances of episodes spread across multiple panels. This expansion enabled different themes from Cuthbert's life to be emphasized, and I'll talk about that a little more in a moment. But I also want to highlight the fact that the use of this technique demonstrates that there would have been space to include additional scenes in the window, and that the omission of posthumous events was not simply due to a lack of space. For example, by using fewer panels to depict scenes from Cuthbert's monastic and eremitic life, it would have been possible to include a selection of posthumous miracles at the bottom of the window. And it's notable that most of the expansion of episodes across multiple panels occurs within this within these two sections. So in these upper two sections here, that are largely dedicated to Cuthbert's eremitic and monastic life. So this might have been intended to emphasize particular facets of Cuthbert's monastic and eremitic actions, but I actually think that it was at least partly intended to ensure that the scenes relating to Cuthbert's life as a bishop were concentrated in the lowest section of the narrative, so down here. I'm going to return to this later, but first I want to draw out some examples of the conscious crafting of the narrative at a more detailed level. And obviously, as I said earlier, I can't discuss every panel in detail, which you'll be pleased to hear. So I'm going to take you through the narrative using a selection of examples. So we'll start with the birth of St. Cuthbert, which is depicted across two panels at the very top of the window. The text of the Irish life describes how, when Cuthbert had been born and placed in his cradle, a brilliant light surrounded the building. And this light was so fierce that the people nearby thought the building was on fire and rushed to extinguish it, only to find that nothing had happened. It was completely fine. At the same time, Cuthbert's birth was miraculously revealed to a bishop who was praying in an oratory, and he too was bathed in light. And it's clear if we compare the text with the panels that the Windows designers were not simply translating these texts into images. Instead, they were combining details from across the text with their own inventions. And as a result, the two panels present a sophisticated and visually dense depiction of Cuthbert's birth and the related events. Although the action of both panels is contained within the architectural frames, the scenes are linked together by the green landscape behind. So this panel is a bit damaged. This would all have been green originally. But we can see how it links them visually together. Panel 7A on the left depicts St. Cuthbert's birth in the left half of the panel, with God looking down from with rays of light up here. We can see Cuthbert's mother and Cuthbert. And then we have on the right-hand side the bishop, who originally would have been placed within this oratory, to simulate an oratory. The bishop stands with a hand raised and his gaze directed to the birth, conveying his distant location at the moment that he miraculously witnessed it. By placing the bishop in panel 7A rather than 9C, the importance of his vision is emphasized and contrasted with the misunderstanding of the lay people seen on the right, who mistake the light of God for fire and rush to extinguish it. Both panels show that the designers were not intending to depict every detail of the text. Cuthbert is not depicted in his cradle, which is still included within the panel just down here, and it is very fragmentary now. Instead, he's shown on the bed between his mother and grandmother, and this emphasises their roles as well as creating a stronger visual focus upon the saint. The two scenes suggest familiarity with the text beyond the key events depicted as well. Cuthbert's grandmother is not explicitly mentioned in the text describing the birth, but her presence can be inferred from both the preceding and subsequent events in the textual versions. And likewise, the landscape that the monastery is set within closely corresponds with a description of Cuthbert's birthplace from the end of the Irish life. The same careful design and desire to create a coherent narrative is evident in the choice and arrangement of scenes, both within the section related to the Irish life and sort of more generally within the window. The surviving textual versions of the Irish life consist of an assemblage of 30 episodes, which seem to have been compiled from at least 3 separate sources, and they don't create a coherent narrative sequence. The scenes selected for Cuthbert's childhood within the window streamline this narrative, showing a more direct progression from Cuthbert's birth and baptism, seen here in the centre, to his introduction and education by a bishop, his miracles in front of the bishop, and then his flight to England with his mother, filling in the years up to the beginning of Bede's prose life in under 10 scenes. Through this selectivity, Cuthbert is provided with an auspicious childhood, a hagiographic trope which had become an increasingly important component of episcopal saints' lives from the 12th century onwards. The final panel in this sequence, which you can see just here, and is one of my favourites within the window, as you might be able to guess why in a moment, appears to combine an episode from the Irish life with a miracle from the first chapter of Bede's prose life. And this opens with, so Bede's prose life opens with an infant foretelling the 8-year-old Cuthbert's future as a bishop, and then rebuking him for playing childishly. The Irish life presents a similar event from Cuthbert's childhood, describing how when he was playing with other boys and doing handstands, his clothes remained vertical to protect his honour. And as you can see in panel 9b, we clearly have this event. We have Cuthbert here on the right, standing with a very magnificently straight robe, while his friend is displaying his underpants. But at the same time, there is a smaller figure in the foreground, just down here, who gazes directly at Cuthbert and has a hand raised in a gesture of speech. And I think this figure can only be the figure described in Bede's prose life. So here we have a panel that combines 2 episodes, providing a seamless transition between the 2 narrative strands. The narrative continues with scenes from St. Cuthbert's childhood as described by Bede. Like the earlier scenes, these emphasise that Cuthbert was favoured by God from a young age, and also provide evidence of his miraculous abilities. So we have at the top of the screen an angel healing his knee, and then at the bottom of the screen, Cuthbert praying to save sailors in a storm. I should really have chosen a less difficult sentence. We know that when designing panels showing scenes found in Bede's prose life, the window's creators drew upon illustrations in a 12th century manuscript made in Durham, British Library, Yates Thompson, MS 26. However, the selection and representation of scenes in the window makes it clear that the manuscript was not directly copied. There are some elements that are very close, but there's clear evidence of adaptation and invention by the glaziers, as well as the combining of the visual details from the manuscript with details from other sources. A good example of this is the depiction of Cuthbert washing the feet of an angel disguised as a man, and then going to fetch bread for the angel, who meanwhile disappears, leaving heavenly bread for St. Cuthbert. And as you can see on the left, and I apologise for the condition of this panel, we have Cuthbert kneeling before the angel disguised as a man, who is seated. He's washing his feet, and originally there were wings here, but they were lost in a restoration, unfortunately. But we can see how this mirrors or very closely follows the figural arrangement from the manuscript. However, the second panel focuses upon Cuthbert going to fetch bread for the angel, rather than the moment that he discovers the miraculous bread. So we can see down here the angel seated at the table, and then Cuthbert pulling these very nice little loaves out of an oven. And this shifts the focus of the panel away from the miracle itself and onto Cuthbert's actions. And I suspect that this was intended to emphasize the importance of hospitality as a facet of ideal monastic behaviour, which potentially tells us something about the interests of the window's commissioners. The designers of the window also employed hagiographic visual topoi, so types, depicting events in a format that conformed to visual conventions that would be familiar to a 15th century viewer. So, for example, sick and dying people are usually shown in bed, as you can see in this panel from the St. William window on the left. And the same visual convention is used in the Cuthbert window in many panels, but I'm showing you an example from panel 10A, which shows the death of St. Aidan. This panel also shows St. Aidan's soul being carried to heaven up here by two angels. And this is a visual topos that is probably familiar to many of you. It's incredibly ancient, really. This panel was part of a pair of panels that showed Cuthbert witnessing St. Aidan's soul being carried to heaven, the pivotal event that inspired him to become a monk. And here we can see how the distribution of the scene across two panels has been used to communicate the miraculous nature of Cuthbert's vision. The settings are distinctly different, with Cuthbert on the left, dressed in red, on a hillside watching sheep. And this contrasts with the interior scene of Aidan's death. The focus of the narrative is made clearer by the placement of Cuthbert at the same level as Aidan's soul, so we have Cuthbert staring directly towards it. And in contrast with the episode of the angel and the heavenly bread, the two panels are intended to be read together as a single moment, rather than two stages in a sequential narrative. And this flexibility of reading patterns requires the viewer to contemplate the window and decode the narrative sequence. As I mentioned before, there is a notable expansion of scenes across multiple panels in the sections focused on Cuthbert's monastic and eremitic life. And this could suggest an interest in these periods in Cuthbert's life and the lessons that they provide. Many of these episodes articulate different facets of Cuthbert's ideal monastic and eremitic life, and the use of multiple panels enables multiple themes to be communicated. For example, in panels 13B and 13C, we see an eagle providing Cuthbert and his travelling companions with a fish, just up here. So here is Cuthbert, here's the eagle, and his travelling assistant is gathering the fish. And this fulfills a prophecy from St. Cuthbert that God would provide food. In the panel below, we see Cuthbert splitting the fish, and he's actually splitting it lengthways, I suppose, as a fishmonger would, to share the fish with the eagle. And this contrasts quite interestingly with the manuscript illustration of the same episode, which only shows the boy following Cuthbert's instruction to share the fish. So we can see the boy in the manuscript cutting the head off the fish, and the eagle's already eating it. By including the preceding scene, the window communicates not only messages of obedience, so the boy following Cuthbert's instruction, and also obviously of sharing of the fish, but panel 13B communicates Cuthbert's faith in God's provision. Obedience is, however, a theme that is particularly prevalent in many of the scenes spread across multiple panels. And in most of the instances, two panels are used to show different scenes from the same episode, reinforcing the message of obedience through repetition. And as you can see in the example on the screen, we have Cuthbert instructing monks to sow barley out of season, which they do, and that's at the top. And then in the second panel, so the lower panel on the screen, Cuthbert is rebuking the birds who have eaten the crop receiving an apology from them, and there's a red bird down here who's doing most of the apologizing, while the others fly away. Through the separation of the obedience of the monks from the transgression, capitulation, and repentance of the birds in the second panel, the viewer is given multiple examples of obedience. And this articulation of ideal monastic obedience obviously has its roots in the hagiographic tradition created by Bede. But the interest in obedience within the Cuthbertine cult can also be linked to the Benedictine community at Durham, who were required to promise obedience before God according to their rule. And indeed, Cuthbert and the other monks within the window are all depicted in blue, which is basically a cipher for the black monastic habits of the Benedictine order, thereby linking Cuthbert to the contemporary cult at Durham. It's also important to recognise that Cuthbert's exemplary monastic and eremitic behaviour contributed to the construction of his identity as an ideal bishop, though. And this is because it drew upon the hagiographic models of Christ and the apostles. For example, we see Cuthbert preaching in this section of the window, providing a model to 15th century clergy who were increasingly encouraged to preach and uphold orthodox beliefs. And this is also quite a good example where of the use of contemporary visual conventions to convey the story. As you can see in the manuscript illustration on the right, Cuthbert is shown preaching from a slight mound, whereas in the window he is depicted preaching from a 15th century pulpit, making his actions abundantly clear. The 15th century saw the promotion of ideal episcopal behaviours, including preaching, hospitality, and obedience, as part of ecclesiastical reforms. And the interest in obedience can therefore also be linked to the importance of maintaining the Christian hierarchy, as expressed in the commemorative section below. Sorry, I've jumped ahead. Likewise, scenes showing that Cuthbert was a well-respected spiritual advisor and leader in a time of change and frequent unrest, and the role of King Egfrith in his election as bishop, provide parallels with the symbolism of the commemorative section. They also had particular relevance to both Langley and the elite clergy who would have seen the window from the choir. And this brings me back to my earlier argument that the arrangement of the narrative panels were intended to emphasize this relationship, and with the expansion of the scenes in the upper sections, ensuring that the scenes focused on Cuthbert's life as a bishop, as well as his death and shrine, were placed immediately above the commemorative section. The close relationship between king and bishop is also articulated by the placement of specific panels. As you can see on the screen, King Egfrith's involvement in Cuthbert's election was placed directly above his consecration, emphasizing the king's role. The consecration scene is also particularly important for articulating Cuthbert's status as an episcopal saint and his relationship with the audience. It not only mirrors the ceremonies that would have been performed beneath the window, but also recalls the direct link between Cuthbert and York, as Cuthbert was believed to have been consecrated in the Anglo-Saxon Minster. The editorial choices made within this lowest section of the narrative suggest a desire to both articulate Cuthbert's sanctity through hagiographic conventions, but also to express his status as a model bishop according to contemporary standards. As we might expect of the culmination of a saint's life, this section is dominated by healing miracles, and you can see them in this diagram on the screen highlighted in orange. Healing miracles were considered the most prestigious authenticators of episcopal sanctity because they overtly imitated Christ's own actions of curing paralysis and blindness, exorcising the possessed, and raising the dead. Cuthbert's actions reflect this belief. He heals by exorcism, cures a paralytic, and heals the dying. In the textual versions, only 2 of these miracles occur before Cuthbert is elected bishop. The rest authenticate his episcopal sanctity, increasing in frequency as the narrative progresses towards its climax, to reinforce how closely Cuthbert echoes Christ at this critical point in the construction of his sanctity. In the window, Cuthbert's healing scenes broadly follow the textual chronology, with one appearing in his monastic life, so just up here, and then most of them appearing within this section depicting his life as a bishop. This creates a visual profusion of depictions of Cuthbert as a bishop performing the most prestigious of miracles. Only one of these, however, is spread across two panels, and it's this one just here, the healing of a servant. It occurs just before Cuthbert is elected as a bishop, so after Egfrith has suggested that he might become a bishop, but before he has been formally elected. And it shows Cuthbert still dressed as a monk, blessing water, which is then taken by a priest to heal the figure in the bed in the lower panel. The use of two panels amplifies the liturgical significance of Cuthbert blessing the water by depicting it separately from the healing itself. In contrast to the manuscript illustration of this scene, Cuthbert is shown in a frontal pose commonly used to depict bishops celebrating Mass, dominating the panel and engaging the viewer directly. Although Cuthbert is not yet a bishop, we can read this as an allusion to the liturgical prerogatives of medieval bishops, which were a key expression of their power and status within the church. And I should say that he doesn't bless any water later in the miracle sequence. So I think this is the only one that they could have used to achieve this. Immediately below this pair is another pair of panels which shows Cuthbert distributing food and clothing. So the top one here, we have one of his attendants holding a shirt, and there's a basket of bread down here. People are holding out bowls. And then at the bottom, he's distributing alms. So we can see Cuthbert with a handful of coins, and then one of his attendants holding a purse. The imagery of these panels is not derived from other surviving visual sources, although it is probably linked to a comment by Bede. And actually, it more closely resembles contemporary secular images of charity. The use of two panels, when one might have sufficed, is also particularly striking, as it's accommodated through the omission of other events from Cuthbert's episcopate. But I think it's important to note that Cuthbert's diligent performance of pastoral duties, which conformed closely to 15th century ideals of episcopal charity, would have been particularly relevant to both Langley and the window's elite clerical audience. Charitable acts were expected of both saintly and earthly bishops, but they were also required from other ranks of the clergy, including the residential canons at York, who numbered amongst the window's audience. The careful narrative design of this section is particularly evident in the lowest row, which focuses upon St. Cuthbert's death and establishment as a saint, compressing events and displaying only the key scenes. So we have on the left his death at his hermitage on Farn. So, sorry, on the left of the window, it's actually this panel here on the right. And we then have his body being taken to Lindisfarne, his first tomb and his shrine. In particular, the panels that you can see on the screen, his first tomb and then his shrine, highlight the importance of the sites themselves by showing people praying rather than by representing specific events, as described by Bede. The conclusion of the narrative with scenes that relate to the establishment of Cuthbert's cult and the omission of other posthumous miracles and events thereby seems to be indicative of the window's intended function and focus. It's aimed at creating a saint rather than celebrating his posthumous miracles. And this is made clearer when we think about the window's visibility and wider architectural setting. In fact, it's almost impossible to see the whole of the window from any single point. And from the choir, and especially from the medieval location of the high altar, the stonework of the arcade directs the viewer to focus upon the commemorative section. I apologise for the condition of this photo. It was taken while there was scaffolding up because the window was coming out. So we can just see the commemorative section here, and then this is the area where all of the episcopal scenes would have been, and then we have the bottom of his eremitic life just here. So from the choir, and especially from the medieval location of the high altar, the stonework of the arcade directs the viewer to focus upon the commemorative section and the narrative scenes showing Cuthbert's life as a bishop. And these are precisely the elements of the window which depict Cuthbert as an episcopal saint, presenting a model of ideal behaviour and order for the high-ranking clergy who would have seen it from the choir, suggesting a conscious use of Cuthbert as a role model. And the focus upon Cuthbert's life and actions within his lifetime, rather than posthumous miracles, reinforces this message. If we consider the wider architectural and devotional context of the window, we can see how the Cuthbertine narrative and overall design responds to this setting. The Cuthbert window was not alone in lighting the medieval high altar. It's directly opposite its architectural twin, a window dedicated to St. William of York, which was installed in around 1414. I've just realised that the date on that slide is wrong. Apologies. Although William is an archiepiscopal saint, his life and his window lacked many of the exemplary models of episcopal behaviour displayed by Cuthbert, such as preaching and charitable acts. By depicting an extensive programme of ideal behaviour, the Cuthbert window provides a didactic message that would otherwise be lacking from the choir glazing. But perhaps more importantly, the imagery of the St. William window is dominated by the saint's posthumous healing miracles, most of which are shown taking place at his shrine in York Minster. And you can see on this diagram, here is the shrine, here is the William window, and here is the Cuthbert window. The decision to omit scenes showing miracles at Cuthbert's shrine from a window so close to St. William's actual shrine may therefore have been intended to prevent Cuthbert's shrine at Durham from overshadowing William's at York, and to ensure that devotion at William's shrine was not discouraged in favour of a, sorry William, slightly more prestigious saint. Stepping back a little further, it's clear that the St. Cuthbert window's design responds to the wider setting of the choir as a whole. The commemorative section of the window echoes the depictions of kings, prelates, and popes in the choir clerestory, as well as the kings and prelates in the lowest row of the Great East window. The modelling of ideal behaviour and articulation of the unified roles of church and crown in upholding and defending the Christian faith integrates the St. Cuthbert window within the hierarchical vision of the Northern Church that is expressed within the 15th century choir glazing. Christopher Norton has argued that this scheme was intended to cast York Minster as, quote, the mother church of the whole northern province, and to express the relationship of the Northumbrian church to the church universal, end quote. St. Cuthbert as the North's premier saint, and St. William as York's local saint, are drawn into dialogue with the Great East window's depiction of creation and apocalypse in what Norton has called a giant triptych around the high altar. To conclude then, while we can't know precisely who was involved in the creation of the Cuthbert window, or be absolutely certain of their intentions, analysis of the window itself suggests that the narrative was supposed to not only communicate Cuthbert's sanctity and ability to act as an intercessor, but also that it was consciously crafted to articulate his status as an episcopal saint, providing a model of behaviour for the window's elite ecclesiastical audience. The window's designers drew upon multiple hagiographic traditions and contemporary visual conventions, constructing a narrative which suggests an awareness of the window's visibility from the choir. In addition, the narrative's articulation of episcopal sanctity, combined with the idealized Christian hierarchy of the commemorative section, integrates it within the wider choir glazing scheme. The sophistication of the window's design is perhaps not surprising, given the elite and well-educated patron and audience, and the capacity of visual media for augmenting hagiographic narratives. Nevertheless, it reveals the complexity of 15th century approaches to narrative design and the skill of the window's unknown creators. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. That was great. As Has anybody got any questions? Well, if no, oh, two, fantastic. Lindy, can we have the first one?
Thank you very much indeed. That was fascinating. You showed the Yates-Thompson life of St. Cuthbert a few times, but almost every time, actually, the image is very, very different from the images that you've got in your cycle. And this is a question from total ignorance. I mean, are there other Cuthbert cycles, either extant, that this window might have used, or do we know about other Cuthbert cycles that might have been lost, but might have provided inspiration for the window? Because I mean, they were strikingly different. I mean, I know you've got a long, however many, 3 centuries between, or is it 4? I can't, but nonetheless, it's sort of picking up, as you said, with the angel and things, picking up on sort of rather different aspects of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a really good question. And actually, I've realised that there is a different version of this talk where I have the closest match between. So with the Yates-Thompson manuscript, we know that it was borrowed by Scroop before his execution, probably for a Cuthbert window in York. And then actually, if you compare all of the individual illustrations with the window, obviously they're doing a lot of stylistic updating, but there are quite a few instances where they're using the formal arrangement of the figures, which I agree, they've completely changed the setting here, but they are keeping that kind of kneeling figure, seated figure composition. Well, absolutely, indeed, yeah. And I think this is the thing, assuming that a visual source is going to be completely, perfectly replicated is one of the things that can be problematic when you're trying to unravel possible sources for this kind of work, because as you say, you've got 300 years between them being created. Did borrow the manuscript. Yeah. So
that is fascinating.
So they are really familiar with it, yeah. There certainly were other, to answer the second part of your question, there certainly were other visual cycles. We know that there were 2 cycles at Durham that are described as showing Cuthbert's life from his birth until his death. But unfortunately, we don't have any more detailed record than that. And so it's difficult to say with any confidence how much they could have inspired the window. I mean, they're made in sort of the late, so sometime around 1415 to 1420, and then probably about 1430. So there's a good chance that the people involved in designing those windows might have been involved in designing this. But certainly in terms of other manuscripts, there's one other illustrated life of Cuthbert from about 1100, Oxford University MS 165, that I don't think was used as a source. Certainly there's no evidence for it being either in Durham or York at this date. Yeah. No problem.
This may be a stupid question. Is there any significance in the inclusion in the panels at the bottom of Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester?
I spent a lot of time trying to work that out. It's a really good question, thank you. Do I have a better picture of him? Yeah, he, for everyone else, this is Humphrey. I couldn't find a specific reason why he might have been included, but Langley did spend quite a lot of time. I'm not going to pretend to understand all of the ins and outs of the political situation, but Langley seems to have spent a lot of time managing the relationship between Humphrey and Henry Beaufort. And I almost wonder if this is a kind of idealized representation of the relationships that he would have liked them to have. There is no evidence that these particular panels were ever disarranged. So the location in the center, I think is probably correct. But no, I've not found any reason why Humphrey might have featured there. I do actually think that it's possible that his face is something close to a likeness, but that's a whole other sort of avenue of speculation.
I was wondering, since you've got William over there and he's slightly older,
Yeah.
whether you didn't imagine that Cuthbert might not have always been imagined to be in that space, because it does,
Yeah.
as you put it,
Yeah.
I was so completely convinced, I kind of thought, yeah.
Yeah, I do. I think they were always intending to have Cuthbert there. I mean, I don't think I'm the only person that thinks that. I think Christopher Norton and Sarah Brown, probably fairly certain we've had this conversation. Yeah, I think the most likely explanation is that Scroop was intending to give the Cuthbert window, given that he was borrowing the manuscript. And then he inconveniently got executed. And someone had to step in. The long time delay is probably then also due to building troubles. So the central tower collapsed also in 1405. And so they actually halted the aisles at the roof line and didn't install the stonework until probably not long before they installed the window. So I think he was always intended to be there with William, yeah.
So thanks very much, Katie. That was terrific. And I had just a quick comment relating to Lindy's question. And is it not true, and perhaps you can tell me if I'm wrong, is it not true that a manuscript was also borrowed from Durham for those painted life of Cuthbert on the stalls at Carlisle?
At Carlisle, yeah. There's no direct evidence of it being borrowed.
No. Right.
But that really is almost a facsimile.
Almost a facsimile, that's right.
It's much, much closer. And there is a connection, I've forgotten, I think it's Archbishop Bell, but I can't remember if it was his connection to Durham or his abbots. You know.
So in that case, it's a different sort of evidence. It's so close to the thing that one can assume with reasonable certainty rather than having to think, oh, there's a document.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I wondered if you'd say, maybe I didn't hear properly, why Langley, what opportunity Langley exploits to do this. I mean, this costs a lot of money and you know, he's in some senses a sort of rival of the Archbishop of York in that he's got this little enclave of his own, which is enormously powerful. And you can see why the York Archbishop wouldn't necessarily want him dabbling in its affair.
Yeah, there's no really solid evidence for why Langley would particularly want to. I think it must lie in his connections, because obviously we have Archbishop Kemp in the window, who is the current Archbishop at the time that the window is finally installed. We also have Bowet, who was the Archbishop immediately after Scroop. And obviously Langley had been Dean of York, and actually was, I think Henry IV wanted him to be elected as Archbishop of York, but the Pope said, no, you killed the last one, you can't have your choice. And by the time that this window is being funded, well, obviously he's dead, but by the time that he must have been thinking about actually giving the money for this window, he's already completed 2 very extensive cycles at Durham. He's refurbished the Galilee, he's refurbished the Chapel of the Nine Altars. So, yeah, I think it's possibly a case of his political and social circle suggesting that he might fund this window through because of his connections, but also just because of his wealth. I don't know. I'd be interested if you have any ideas.
Well, not to air now. I just wondered, sorry to extend, but I just wondered, given that he paid for this glazing of Cuthbert narrative scenes in the Chapel of the Nine Altars at Durham, do you suppose that he used the same, I know that glass, there's not an atom of it left, but do you suppose that he used the same team of glaziers? I don't know anything about these glaziers.
It's possible, but it would depend. I mean, this is one of the things that is really frustrating about this, is when they actually did the designs for the window, because obviously if they knew the dimensions of the stonework, they were intending to put the window in, from about 1400, then you've got 40 years when they could have designed something and the design could have been kicking around, but it's unlikely. Certainly the glazing at Durham is happening sort of 20 years and 10 years before, so there's a chance, but it's not certain. I would love to examine some of the fragments that survive at Durham just in case there's any kind of stylistic evidence, but I don't think there's enough surviving, really.
You know there are fragments there, do you?
Yeah, there is a couple of fragment windows, but not necessarily of a specific Cuthbert cycle, just glass of that era.
Thank you very much.
It looks as though that's all the questions. So again, let's thank Katharine for a really splendid paper. Thank you.